Let me start by defining what I think is a well-functioning board. I'll put it around 3 Ds. It has to be dynamic, it has to be deliberative, and it has to be decisive. And so by dynamic, it has got to compose of members who are open, who are frank, and importantly, who speak up. Deliberative would imply a wide-ranging contributions of insight into markets, insight into macroeconomics, insight into politics, insight into people, into talent management, a whole range of it. And finally, decisive. In today's fast-moving time, a board has to make some courageous decisions. It has to have a diversity of board members with different experiences, different perspectives, different insights that can contribute. And it's got to be a very coherent, cohesive board, ready to make decisions when the time comes. I think the board agenda needs to be able to ask, what is the black swan event that can affect our business so considerably that we would be at risk? And in that risk, how do we mitigate it? And we mitigate it by having a diversity of businesses, so that if it hits one business, we have other legs that would support us through the crisis. Every business needs to say, how's the world going to change? And what does that change mean to my business? Boards have to be ready to cope, and that means having to build agility and resilience in the business model of a company. And in that business model, have a lot of what-if scenarios. I would say that the learning is what is acceptable today may not be acceptable tomorrow. And tomorrow you might be called to question for what we've done today. And the biggest examples of that is climate change. Continuing on with the same old may find themselves one day running out of road, right? So those who sell bottled water have to rethink how they might be selling their water in the future. For example, those who use a lot of energy will have to rethink what is the type of energy that they can use, that they should use, and how to be more productive. It is helpful to focus on what makes sense for the company. And much of it could be aligned around the interest of the company. So one example that SETS has is about food wastage. We're about food. So we have got to help rethink how we can reduce food wastage, as an example. So I think linking it back to what the company is about, so that it makes sense for the company, is one important pillar. In the past, when the markets were not so fast moving, one could set a strategy and say, in 5 years, I'd like to get from A to B. The problem we have today is that the B shifts very quickly. Therefore, an agile strategic pathway must have that dynamism to shift according to how the ground is shifting in that time ahead. So that's one. 2, execution. That's key. And execution means about commonality of purpose and understanding throughout the execution by all people, knowing where they are and where they're going. And finally, in today's battle for talent, it is about winning the hearts and minds of our people in order to serve the markets. I think diversity is a subject matter that is pretty much on the minds of boards and board chairmen, key decision makers, and of nominating committees. The most common, because it's the easiest to identify, would be gender diversity. So as an example, years ago we were looking at women in Japan and the decisions they make. And we found out that 70% of the women in Japan make the decisions on the cars that the family buy. Now that's important. So it's those kind of perspectives to bring to the table where gender diversity is important. Many boards would say, I'm looking for a board member, but the board member has to be experienced and the board member has to have time. When that happens, it devolves to looking for someone who's been on boards already and likely someone who is at the further end of their career path. But if your business is about serving the consumer market, you've got to understand the younger generations in order to understand their tastes, in order to understand their interests, and in order to understand their buying dynamics. So it may be that boards have to consider age and how to bring about generational views that in the past may not have been considered. I would suggest that boards should not set aside first-time directors. I think each of us need to think about how we do bring first-time directors on board and add to the gene pool of our experienced directors here in Singapore. So that's one. And the second, which I speak a lot about, is one of cultural diversity. And when I bring out cultural diversity, people think about it as diversity on nationalities, maybe diversity on religion. I look at cultural diversity to include economic strata. And I'll give you an example. This is an example of many, many years ago. It is about Unilever and how they sell shampoo. And it's when they got women thinking about their products that they came up with these little sachets of shampoo that took the Indian market by storm. Because they realized that the women in India, the bulk of the women in India, firstly, cannot afford to buy them in bottles, big bottles, nor do they have storage space. So it's much easier for them to buy them in sachets. And those are the perspectives that we would not have if we didn't understand the different economic strata. So I would say this is where the Council of Board Diversity comes in. Encouraging, trying to harness everyone towards the understanding of the value of diversity, providing the channels for boards to increase their diversity, and being a little bit of a matchmaker. And I think a diversity brings about a balanced assessment of risk return, and all these add to deliberations, and I believe add to stronger and more robust decision making. I look for boards that have truly open and frank discussions. I am a believer that we should all speak up frankly, contribute and learn from each other. That's the most important. And therefore the chairman makes a big difference in how the chairman drives the discussion. I am well aware that I need to come to the board table with as broad a view, as diverse a perspective as I can have to contribute to the board discussions. So I read widely, I listen deeply. I'm always very interested to hear what people have to say. And I learn. I learn in all conversations that I take part in. Doesn't matter who it is. But I'm learning because I'm asking questions.